focuses on Heidegger. He's focusing on Heidegger and the phenomenological tradition. He's part of the education team of MIAS, where he's been serving for almost 2 years now, if not over 2 years. Bharatwaj recently published the paper, The Transimmanence of the Real, Ontological Pluralism in the School of Ibn Arabi, which was edited by Pablo Beneto. And his next article is titled, You Are a Puzzle Lock, a Phenomenological Analysis of Perplexity in Philosophy East and West, which examines the Urdu poem Tume Gorah Dandahu from a Heideggerian perspective. His academic and activist interests are political pluralism and rising extremism. And I'm looking forward to your talk, Bharatwaj. So please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that, for the introduction. Thank you, Omar. Thank you, Chris, for the planning, and thank you to the society for this wonderful opportunity. I'm really humbled, and I'm really filled with gratitude, and I'm looking forward to the evening. So I have a presentation that, yes, Chris. Thank you very much. So Chris, you can actually go to the second slide. Okay. My presentation attempts to look at the teachings of Ibn Arabi through the lens of phenomenology. I'm especially interested in the notions of pluralism and polysemy entailed in the Akbarian tradition. In my paper for the journal Religions that Omar mentioned, I studied the interpenetration of transcendence and immanence in Ibn Arabi and the polysemic hermeneutics it gives rise to. In today's presentation, a lot of these discussions will be continued. My presentation is divided into 3 interrelated parts. The first part is the Barzakh, and the second one is delimitation, and finally, transimmanence. What we will pay attention to specifically is the philosophical and even logical structures underlying these concepts. Next slide, please. The political philosopher Simon Critchley, who teaches at the New School, claims in his book, The Faith of the Faithless, that today's political reality can be defined as one of identitarian, religiously motivated violence. One can subtly turn this around and say that the political reality of the world today is one of violent identification, that the construction of identity itself involves violence. Examples of this can be seen in the growing religious nationalisms all over the world, including India. These constructions of national identity, cleansed of internal fissures, cleansed of the play of ambiguity, in-betweenness, and polysemy, is itself violence. Such unambiguous identity is related closely to the unswerving attachment to an exclusivist truth. Such conceptions of truth itself becoming a totem for forming this identity. However, as a Heidegger scholar, Ian Thompson notes, all such group identifications and all such purveying of exclusivist truth contain within them the hard kernel of insecurity, because identities are simply more complex and cannot be sustained or grasped in this monolithic fashion. Yeah, this slide. It is in this context and the contemporary situation of violent identification that we ask what the Islamic mystical tradition in general and the school of Ibn Arabi in particular can teach us about the elusive meaning of identity and the ambiguities that surround it. Before we go further, I wish to note here what Shahab Ahmed wonderfully states about what he calls the Sufi philosophical amalgam and their sense of identity as providing explorative authority, and explorative authority is the business of setting out into the unknown, the uncertain, the unexperienced, the unsettling, the new. Next slide. Instead of the rocky solidity of rock-solid identities, the Sufis bring the softness of metaphor, majaz. Ahmed quotes the maxim, al-majaz kantarat al-haqiqa. Metaphor is the bridge to the truth. And yet this haqiqa, this reality or real truth in Ahmed's fascinating term, does not lend itself to be totalized and finally captured by some system or doctrine or philosophical position, or by some final assembly of metaphors. The real truth for the Sufis is the sheer abundance of truth. And so this walking on the bridge of metaphors is never ending. Because this abundant truth cannot be finalized and totalized, the majaz itself assumes central importance, becoming itself a form of reality. And so do bridges. And the notion of the bridge is what we most need today. The bridge is not a mere ladder which one can throw off after safely and securely landing on the top of the building. Being itself, reality itself here assumes the nature of a bridge and passage. Next slide. Shahab Ahmed defines the situation wonderfully as the slide before this. Yeah. Ahmed defines the situation wonderfully as the ambiguity and mutual embeddedness of the two sides of reality. That is, the mutually constitutive experiential ambiguity of the alam al-majaz and the alam al-haqiqa. Next slide. He further goes on to describe the metaphor as a bridge on which one is forever crossing back and forth in the act of meaning making. So what do we have here? We have polysemous meaning making and interpretative non-finality. Next slide. Section 1, Barzakh. The last slide. Yeah. With the notion of ambiguity and bridges, we are in a perfect position to discuss Ibn Arabi's notion of the Barzakh in relation to the conceptual problem of identity. The term Barzakh is used in the Quran with two significant meanings, one as the partition between the two seas, and the other as the partition between this world and the next. Ibn Arabi reads this Quranic notion of the Barzakh in all its philosophical and phenomenological depth. In the Futuhat, Ibn Arabi sees the Barzakh, the threshold or the in-between, not just as a partition or separator, but also as a conjoiner and the very source of the two sides of which it is the between. This is a fascinating perspective. It means that the two sides of the equation are not preformed or pre-given objects between whom there is the Barzakh. Rather, it is the Barzakh itself that gives each of the sides their very identity. So when we arrive at the scene, there is always already our betweenness. And indeed, for Ibn Arabi, the whole of existence is betweenness. Already we can see how the bridge, al-Qantara, is at once the mutually constitutive space for al-Majaz and al-Haqiqa. Next slide. Next slide, Chris. Okay. With the notion of let us. Okay, I lost my. Okay, let us allow Ibn Arabi to explain this to us through the Futuhat, and our focus will be the 63rd chapter dedicated to the Barzakh. What is the Barzakh? Ibn Arabi says a Barzakh is something that separates two other things while never going to one side, as for example, the line that separates shadow from sunlight. He goes on then to explain the nature of this in-between as outside sense perception. For, he argues, if it is perceived by the senses, it is of the two things and not the Barzakh. Next slide. However, the Barzakh is not only intelligible, it separates an intelligible from a non-intelligible, and so is, in other words, the foundation of intelligibility. Yet it is not intelligible like a sensible thing. Rather, the Barzakh belongs to the realm of imagination. How can we describe imagination? Ibn Arabi says, the reality of imagination is continual change in every state and manifestation in every form. This implies that the in-between, which is of the nature of constant flux, cannot be rationally or sensibly pinned down. Just as, to take the example of Ibn Arabi, the dividing line between light and darkness can't be pinned down. This is what makes Bruce Lawrence say in his essay, Writing in the Eye of the Storm, that what is crucial in understanding in Ibn Arabi is the irreducibility of the Barzakh itself. Next slide. But what is even more radical in Ibn Arabi's irreducible in-between is that this Barzakh is not a later addition after the fact of two things coming together. Rather, as Ibn Arabi puts it, and one must pay attention to this slowly and closely, any two adjacent things are in need of a Barzakh, which is neither the one nor the other, but possesses the power of both. So neither nor and both. The very being of things then is located in their interrelations. And without these interrelations, the identity of things will not be possible. Things are not finally settled in themselves, but need to be constantly traversed in interpretation and meaning making. Next slide. So far, we are thinking of Barzakh in a largely logical and epistemological framework. It is important to note that to Ibn Arabi, the Barzakh has ontological significance as well. We saw about that things have a need for the Barzakh between them. This is true for the whole of existence for the Shaykh. The Barzakh is like the dividing line between existence and non-existence. It is neither existent nor non-existent, he says. This he terms as the supreme Barzakh, which stands for the entirety of reality and all the possible forms of existence. And these possibilities are ever renewed, ever regenerated, and in constant flux. Such a metaphysic implies that the world and the word are ever open for polysemic interpretation, as Federico Salvaggio argues in a recent article. Identity and meaning making then cannot be pre-given and fixed, but must be constantly in the making. The world that this opens up is not one of solipsistic self-isolation, for no one thing can it be itself without the other. It is apt that such an ontology rests on the notion of imagination, which, as we saw, is ever-changing and renewing. However, this does not mean that all identity is dissolved. When A and B are A and B because of their betweenness, this does not dissolve the A-ishness of A or the B-ishness of B. It rather makes us sensitive to the ambiguity and flux involved in all identity formation, including the nexus of connections that makes us who we are. So far as religious identification is concerned, it reminds us to maintain our identities while being sensitive to the other possible and variegated forms of religious worlds that others attach themselves to. For these other worlds play a constitutive role in our own religious identification. 2. Delimitation. Before entering the notion of delimitation, it will be useful to begin with the place of delimitation in modern philosophy. I hold that the basic phenomenological substructure here has important similarities with Ibn Arabi's approach. This allows us to place Ibn Arabi's approach in the present context. In the phenomenological tradition, what is central is delimitation, concealment, inadequacy, veiling as opposed to unveiling, and finitude. In his 1913 work, Ideas 1, while describing the act of perception, Edmund Husserl, the father of phenomenology, explains the notion of adumbration in these words. A spatial being can appear only in a certain orientation, which necessarily pre-delineates a system of possible new orientations, each of which in turn corresponds to a certain mode of appearance, which we can express, say, as givenness from such and such a side. He goes on to say, next slide, moreover, and this is also an essential necessity, the perception of a physical thing involves a certain inadequacy. Of necessity, a physical thing can be given only one-sidedly. And that signifies not just incompletely or imperfectly, but precisely what presentation by adumbration prescribes. To put all this in a very simple form, what Husserl is saying is, one-sidedness is not a lack, but rather the essential requirement for perception and meaning-making. So the chair comes to us in facets or in faces, going back to the French root for the term facets. So taking the example of the chair as a spatial object, For the perception and intelligibility of the chair, the whole of the chair with all its sides cannot present itself all at once. For the front side of the chair to be manifest, the back of the chair must be non-manifest. The whole unity of the chair can be captured only by adumbration of various profiles of the chair and through a spatial and embodied interaction with it, for example, going around the chair. And yet, as we move to the back of the chair, the front must now be absent from perception. This absence is not a negative thing. It is not failure, but is the essential ingredient in all perception and intelligibility. Next slide. Husserl's student, Martin Heidegger, takes some of these insights over into his whole thinking about Sein selbst, being itself. For the later Heidegger, being shows itself historically. Being shows itself through core names or terms like idea in Plato, energeia in Aristotle, the creator god in Aquinas, the will to power in Nietzsche, and so on. Through these master names or dominant concepts, being shows itself as a network or system of meaning. Once the dominant concept of being has been stabilized, then it can be forgotten, and Dasein, or the human being, can move about its business. Much like once we know the working of a door handle, we can forget about it and move on to the business of opening doors and getting into rooms. Thus, Heidegger describes metaphysics as Seinsvergessenheit, a forgetting of the total abundance and excess of being, in favor of one of these dominant concepts or names. However, Vergessenheit or forgetting is not a hindrance or negative concept, but is rather, like Husserl's one-sidedness, the means for being to show itself in a particular delimited structure of showing. And yet, as we can see, this very showing is simultaneously a refusing to show. For being's showing to Plato as idea or form is simultaneously being's refusal to show itself as will to power. For Heidegger, the history of being is its showing itself in one epoch, while at the same time a refusal of how it shows itself to another epoch. The term epoch itself comes from the Greek epoche, which means bracketing or putting into parentheses other modes of showing. Why is this parenthesis necessary? Without these particular limited theses of being, as Heidegger calls it, going back to the Greek term thesis, which means to put something up, without these particular theses of being, the full abundance of being will lead to an overkill, leading to no intelligibility or meaning at all. I argue that this fundamental phenomenological understanding of the abundance of being is understood by the Sufi mystics of the school of Ibn Arabi. They not only understand this abundance, and they anticipate the dialectical relationship between veiling and unveiling, concealing and unconcealing. When the real shows itself in different doctrinal positions or in different prophetic dispensations, it is simultaneously a veiling of how the real shows itself in other doctrinal configurations and prophetic traditions. The real, which overwhelms any possibility of grasping, shows itself through limited forms. In that sense, every belief regarding the real is a certain construction, a certain knot that is tied. The only way out of this, the only way out of idolatry, will be precisely this recognition of the limitation of every comprehension of him. Tawheed is the recognition of how every conceptualization of him is limited. That recognition is the way out of idolatry. Just as in the famous hadith of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, the only comprehension of the real is the recognition of the non-comprehensibility of the real. Next slide. Or, as the Pakistani Sufi poet Naz Khayalvi puts it, Haat aao to but, haat na aao to khuda ho. If you are grasped, you're an idol. Only if you're not grasped do you remain God. Ibn Arabi says, in discussing doctrinal differences, that to hold to a particular doctrine or belief is to attempt to grip the real. Yet he says, next slide, his being gripped is his self-disclosure. His being gripped is his self-disclosure in the form of the belief of everyone who has a belief concerning him. The real becomes, as it were, constricted and contracted by the beliefs. The most fascinating thing in this, however, is what he says next. Were he not like this, he would not be God. yet he is God of the cosmos. There is no doubt. With this, we are back to the concept that we began with, Barzakh. Next slide. The knottings of the heart, or the beliefs regarding the real, both capture and fail to capture God at the same time. In fact, just like the whole of creation, the knots are both veils and windows to the real. He shows this, Ibn Arabi shows this by saying, since reason maintains that God cannot be restricted, and then says paradoxically, while the actual situation demands the existence of restriction, he describes himself as clement, as merciful of the different delimitations and restrictions we have in our conceptualization of him. The discussion on delimitation so far takes us to the final section on transimmanence. Before that, we must note here what this discussion implies for the question of pluralism. I wish to bring up Darashikoh, the heir apparent to Shah Jahan's throne, the Mughal emperor. Darashikoh was the first translator of the Upanishads, who in his Majma al-Bahrain wrote about Vedanta and Sufism as two truth-knowing groups. One of his most pointed expressions of this uncapturable and thus plural understanding of the real is the statement that he quotes from Lal Das, the Hindu saint of which he was a very good friend, to the effect that truth is not the monopoly of any one religion. This overcoming of monopoly and monosemy in favor of a polysemy of doctrinal possibilities is what Ibn Arabi's understanding of the real teaches Darashikoh. The understanding that all knottings of the heart both capture and fail to capture the real allows for the sensitivity to the non-finality of any particular knot and the possibility of other knottings and other grippings. Third, transimmanence. The present slide. Finally, in conclusion, we look at the notion of transcendence and immanence and their interpenetration, which I term transimmanence. This notion follows directly from the discussion of delimitation we just saw. Ibn Arabi says, God possesses non-delimited being, but no delimitation prevents him from delimitation. On the contrary, he possesses all delimitations. Hence, he is non-delimited delimitation. This means that the transcendence of God is intimately tied to his immanence. In the Fusus, in the chapter on Noah, Ibn Arabi says, and next slide. In fact, Ibn Arabi sings, this is a poem, and he says that if you hold transcendence, you restrict him. And if you hold immanence, you limit him. But if you hold the two doctrines, you're right, and you will be a leader and a master in knowledge. Beware of likening him if you hold duality, and of making him transcendent if you unify him. You are not he, but you are he, and you see him in the essence of things, both boundless and restricted. What Ibn Arabi is suggesting here is that the real transcends even transcendence. The real is in excess of all the doctrinal or intellectual conceptions, and yet this excess does not locate him outside in some metaphysical sky. Ibn Arabi argues that such location would be a form of hidden immanence, and the real transcends even that. Thus, a genuine transcendence and also a genuine immanence requires that this abundance of the real is itself immanent, which means that the immanent structures are themselves pregnant with excess. This is what makes Ibn Arabi logically argue for the ever-moving, flux-like nature of the cosmos. It is also what allows for the ontological pluralism of this system. In other words, if the transcendence of the real is relocated immanently in the immanence, that means the immanent structures of meaning themselves become infinitely changing and moving and flux-like. Next slide. Next slide. Is it? No. As the inimitable Shahab Ahmed puts it in commenting on this chapter of the Fusus, this makes it a very subtle operation to try to extricate God from all existing things and has also the effect of rendering all things true in the degree that they are manifestations of God. When the abundance, next slide, when the abundance of the real, when its sheer transcendence through a dialectical bending of itself is located in immanence itself, we have a conception of the world that is characterized by the conceptual and practical exploration, production, accommodation, appreciation, and preservation of difference and contradiction, to quote Ahmed again. Such an understanding of immanence in recent philosophy, especially spearheaded by Jean-Luc Nancy, is called open immanence. Nancy scholar B.C. Hutchins sees such a world as characterized by incessant strangeness and by the multiple reticulations of meaning. The Sheikh al-Akbar would agree. Next slide. How does such a conception of reality help us rethink the question of violence and exclusivism? Naz Khyalvi says this about the real in True Akbarian Transimmanence. Next slide. Previous one. Yes. You are in the church, you are in the mosque. You are in the throne, you are on the earth. Whatever the extent of one's vision, there you are for him. He goes on to then ask, when all are lovers of your name, then why are there quarrels about Rahim and Ram? In fact, as we have seen, in order to preserve the abundance of the real, one has to allow for the possibility of its flooding over into other loci of religious manifestation. For no locus can finally and totally capture and pin the real down. To speak in Husserlian terms, the real adumbrates through multiple knots and profiles. And to speak in Heideggerian terms, the real shows itself parenthetically. Next slide. I shall end with an anecdote about Darashiko's execution. During his trial, he is believed to have been asked by the court to draw firm doctrinal exclusive boundaries between the religions. To this, he is believed to have responded, how can you draw a line in water? Does he mean that no identity should be affirmed? No fixed positions assumed? Not at all. We should remember that even lines drawn on water are lines and are affirmations of form and identity. And yet at the same time, they are indicative of an identity that is ever subject to imminent erasure, revision, and renewal, ever moving and ever exploring. Knots are knots, and they grip the real. And that is no small thing. And yet what we are being alerted to is the recognition that knots imply constant unknotting and reknotting. Final slide, last slide. I come back to the political situation of the world that we sketched at the beginning and what the great Sheikh can teach us. I think that in an age of violent identification, the Sufis of his school teach us the virtue of bewilderment, water-drawn demarcations, and the virtue of holding our hearts in living flux, ready for any form. Imbibing these teachings and recognizing the place of the other in the formation of one's self-identity is the difficult yet unavoidable political and cultural challenge today. Thank you.
Thank you, Bharatwaj, for a wonderful presentation. Always wonderful to listen to you. Thank you. And now we have some time, 10 minutes or so of questions and answers. So the floor is open for questions. If you want to ask a question, please press the raised hand. In the meanwhile, while you're thinking about the questions you want to ask, I actually have something, just a thought that comes to me, Bharatwaj. You know, Ibn Arabi does speak about the Barzakh being neither nor. So if something is perceived by the senses, it is not the Barzakh, it's either or. But at the same time, also, he does teaches us, rightly so, that all there is the Barzakh, and we ourselves are the ultimate Barzakh. And indeed, it has to be so, because on the two sides of the Barzakh is, as you said, existence and non-existence, which could also be said to be the absolute one, and the impossible plural. The absolute one cannot be perceived, is absolute one. Any perception is not he. And the impossible plural is impossible. So all that is perceived, seen from the other side, is the barzakh. Whereas, you know, like it's even the barzakh itself has two definitions, but it's never either or. At the same time, it has to be either or. It can't be the barzakh. So even within the definition of the barzakh itself,
there is a barzakh.
There is a barzakh.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Yes. I liked how you created that polarity of the one and the plural, and in some sense I was thinking about the immutable essences, which in some sense might bring that plurality to some order, perhaps, because sheer plurality would not be conceivable. I mean, it wouldn't produce meaning. So the immutable essences could be seen as that middle position. It just occurred to me when you were saying this, when you're making that polar distinction.
Right. And another thought that I have, and then you're right, Frank, it's your turn. Another thought that I have is just on identity. Do we have to call it identity? Because the term identity usually refers to how we identify, how we define ourselves. So once you have an identity, it is who you are. But perhaps in the tradition, in the Sufi tradition and other mystical traditions, there is only one identity. So all these, and only one. So all these things that we really call identity, perhaps the mistake where the extremists or you know, like the exclusivists make when they is that what they call identity is not an identity, it's heritage and culture. So it's not that my identity is Middle Eastern, Muslim, British later on, etc. These are culture and heritage, which are extremely important to make me comprehensible. But they cannot be said to be identity.
Yeah, but I would completely agree with that. The only reason why it was sort of necessary to use the term is because of the current situation where identity becomes such a force, which and how that identity is also formed is such a, in some sense, a political reality. So to go away from that, that's where that reference would become necessary, as you know, something to move away from.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Frank?
Yes, thank you. That was great, Bharatwaj. I saw it as a logical way of proving that logic cannot prove anything. It's like you're looking at the transcendent, or you want to see God, you want to see the whole, you want to see transcendent. It's everywhere. How can you find something if it's everywhere? Because wherever you look, there it is. And I like the way you said, you know, that limitation, while we look at it as identity and violent, but really limitation is necessary, because without that, you can't see anything. To see, we use our own eyes, which are limited. You have to limit something to be able to see it. So obviously, if you did that, that's a valid positive thing. You're looking at something, but you are looking at the limited. You're not seeing the whole thing. So you lost your wholeness at the same time. So somehow you need to be able to see the whole thing at once and to see the limited part at the same time. And that requires us to change in such a way that we can have within us the capacity to do that, because it's our capacity before doing that is either the limited or we transcend, one or the other. We go from seeing, you know, the beauty and love and everything is perfect to seeing something limited, which is violent. So if we're able to see both, I think this is really where the challenge is, isn't it?
Yes, I think so too. And another thing that I think is that an identity which is restricted to a monolithic conception does not see itself as limited. it sees itself as, in some sense, unique and in some sense as unlimited. So, for example, Omar and I were having a conversation a week ago, actually, and we were talking about scientism, where the problem of scientism is that, not of science, but of scientism, is that it doesn't see science as having a certain delimitation. It sees that it looks at science as something infinitely capable. So a recognition of limitation also opens the eye to plural or other possibilities in which things are limited. So it opens our eyes to the other. So yes, so thank you. Chris.
Omar, you're muted.
Oh, I actually said, Chris, it's your
Okay,
turn.
all right. Okay, thanks. Yeah, Bharatwaj, one of the word that struck me when you used the bridge, and then what I wanted to ask you related to the bridge, because so we have this conceptual discussions today, and you draw in from heritage that we have that's lovely, that's very useful. Could you perhaps briefly share in your own setting, because you're involved with activism and with other groups, the concrete way of bridging this between some pockets that wanted to not tightly to a certain identity? So if you can share with us some experience with what some people are doing to do this bridge of expanding this idea of polysemy and so on. Thank you.
One, that's a interesting, good, actually important question. I was recently at a retreat on religious pluralism, because I mean the political situation also demands work on this, and I think one effective thing for me was in actually Ibn Arabi. I got at least 3 opportunities to speak to people who were not like extremely radically gone conclusions. I mean, but they were on the fence, and they did not have this exposure to this aspect of at least the Islamic tradition. And I think then information, education, conversation, that is a good way to solve some of these, I think. And yeah, I mean, it's a difficult kind of thing, because Ibn Arabi is hard. I mean, in the transimmanence point, for example, I mean, these are so intricate concepts, and it's really hard to put them in a way that's easy to comprehend. But then there's also poetry which can be used. There are these different ways in which this side of at least this one religious tradition and this side of that tradition is should be more and more highlighted, I think. I'm speaking from India's perspective, but yeah.
Thank you. And Reem?
So firstly, thank you, Bharatwaj. Hi. So thank you so much for this fascinating talk. So I've been attending quite a few of your talks, and I'm a big fan now. So can we have more of these in the future, please?
I wish to actually express my gratitude to you, because I remember, I mean, the chapter which I used for this the most, which is chapter 63, you have taught that, and I think your focus on hermeneutics is, I mean, that's very important. That has had a huge impact on me. So thank you. I'm a fan.
Thank you.
I'm a student. Sorry, I shouldn't say fan.
We are each other's students in that case. What I wanted to say is that I remember a couple of years you were kind of reading Ibn Arabi through Heidegger, and now listening to you again, it feels like you are reading actually Heidegger with Ibn Arabi. So I was wondering, since now you're quite at an advanced stage of your research, I'm curious about any recent insights that you had regarding this kind of a meeting between these two geniuses, really. So just curiosity, whether you had any recent insights or something that you could share with us in terms of your current research. And I'll be grateful for that. Thank you, Bharatwaj.
I mean, it's not an insight, but it's a development in Heidegger scholarship, where at least there are 2 books now from Heidegger studies, and these Heidegger scholars are paying attention to the Sufi tradition. So one author that I had mentioned to Omar last time is Richard Capobianco, who in one of his books has a chapter on Rumi and Heidegger, which I found really very interesting. And there's another book which mentions Rumi because Rumi happens to be the most famous Western or the most famous Sufi in the Western world. So that is one thing that I saw, that there is now a recognition of taking of the similarities between the 2 traditions. But the main insight for me was the insight of how for Ibn Arabi concealment and unconcealment, or veiling and unveiling, are always together. And I find that to be an important Heideggerian position. And in fact, I understand Heidegger through Ibn Arabi. I mean, it's not only like that. I mean, so Ibn Arabi gives a very nuanced way of looking at this dialectic. And in that paper which was mentioned by Omar, I was looking at this interaction between unconcealment and concealment, or veiling and unveiling. And one of the things I discovered is that there's so much depth to that. And I could see a lot of interesting things there. So this is something that I more recently saw as a link between the 2. And there are others also, but this has been the sort of the recent. And then I also saw through Shahab Ahmed, I could see how this is not just theoretical, but in the Islamic civilization. And Ahmed is mainly focused on Sufism in general, but he is also talking about post-Ibn Arabi Sufi history. And he shows how this way of understanding truth, this way of understanding reality, has had an immense impact on the history of the whole tradition and how it interprets text and so on. So to answer the question, sort of in this longish way, yeah, that interrelationship, and then how it is a historical fact also, which has been applied, and the results of that in history. I mean, those are some of the recent.
Thank you, Bharatwaj. Noor, now we're running a bit over time, so let's try to keep the next question and answer both within 5 minutes, please, so we don't end up using the break time, which is very important.
Mine is very brief. I just wanted to follow up on that particular phrase you mentioned from Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan, this tum ek gurak dhanda ho. So in my own language, I'm from Bangladesh, Bengali, gurak dhanda is a puzzle of the size of a globe. It's a puzzle. So you are a puzzle of the size of a globe. So that is what that phrase in my language means. But what was the Heidegger terminology? This is what I missed. You said something. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. So the word that I used was perplexity, but I don't see if I have that paper. There is a paper on that poem by Amir Latif.
Okay, send us that one. That's one only query is. But otherwise, yeah, because of time, yeah, I'll talk to you later.
So the way he, just a minute, the way he explains the meaning of Gorakh Dhanda is a toy with a string and colors, And if you pull the string, the colors change. So the idea is that God has multiple forms or aspects, which are like these multiple colors. Like so that's how he evokes that that term.